Hi everyone, just going to give it a couple more minutes for the room to fill up. I think we're expecting a few more, so just bear with. Hi to everyone that's managed to join. Welcome. I'm Han. I'm the Global Comms Lead here at Clarinet. Just want to give a really quick shout out to our teams watching in Portugal and the Netherlands. Hello. So an hour is not a very long time for us to explain exactly what a Security Operations Centre does. We're going to give it our absolute best shot. For what we are unable to cover today, one, leave your questions in the chat, and two, this is one of a very small series of events. We've got one coming up in October, on October 20th, another one on December 1st. If you'd like to receive communications for those events and potentially attend, we'd love to have you there. But without further ado, I will leave you in Tom's very, very safe and capable hands.
Thank you, Han. So yeah, so today I just wanted to sort of give a rundown on what a SOC actually does, and have a sort of a conversation about what an analyst is doing inside a SOC to turn an event into an incident and help along that journey. So a lot of this is angled from sort of an MSSP point of view, because that's what I do and that's what we do, but it's really sort of a catch-all between any SOC. So this is, in a nutshell, what we're doing inside a SOC to go from something we see from an alarm to helping someone along that incident to pull out that information as quickly as possible. So if I start going through my slides, so the agenda for this particular presentation is there's about 10 minutes of sort of what is a SOC at the front of this, and then we'll go into the demo, which will last sort of about half an hour. The reason it's half an hour is because we have a half an hour SLA inside our SOC for an analyst to go from an alarm to assigning it a correct priority, so P4, P3, P2, 1. So I just want to quickly run through these slides about explaining what a SOC is in a nutshell, how a SOC is laid out, and then get into what are they actually doing and what are they seeing on a day-to-day basis. So a bit about me. So I'm Tom. I'm lead Microsoft engineer at Clarinet. I've been in the industry now for about 10 years, 6 of those dedicated in security. My day-to-day at the moment is a lot of Microsoft orientated things. So I spend a lot of time doing Microsoft products, Sentinel, Defender, but I also manage a lot of our EDR and MDR solutions, so Alien Vault as well. I spend the majority of my time engineering solutions, but I also help out and dabble in the operational side in the SOC, and have built and engineered SOCs in the past as well. So what is a SOC? And I think that's a question sometimes you get, particularly from people who are just starting out in security and obtaining security and trying to look at this. So a SOC is a security operations center in its basic form. A SOC uses traditionally a SIEM. A SIEM is a security information and event management tool. It's basically a log aggregator. It collects logs, it puts them in front of an analyst, and it allows them to search large amounts of data and query data it also allows to offload a lot of the manual work in looking at things, pulling out alarms. So at its core root, that's what a SIEM is. It's a log aggregator that does some stuff, alarms come out, and the analysts use that. But one of the things that got said to me when I was particularly starting out in security, and particularly in SOCs, was SOC is not SIEM and SIEM is not SOC. And it kind of sounds a bit silly when you say it out loud, but at the root of that, a SOC is more than its SIEM. A SOC is not just using SIEM. It's the analysts, it's the structure, it's the policies, it's the procedures, it's everything that goes around the SIEM. And also, a SIEM does not make a SOC. If you have a SIEM, you don't have a SOC. You just have a tool. That tool needs to be maintained, nurtured, brought to life, maintained and structured, and making sure that it's up to date and current. So it's kind of a flippant throwaway status to say that SOC is not SIEM and SIEM is not SOC. But I think it's something that's quite important to realize. And I cover this a little bit later on as well, around what exactly a SOC is made up of and how it's not just those. So in a traditional SOC, and this is our SOC, SOCs can be structured in many different ways. This is a traditional hierarchy. It's how our SOC is structured, and it's how a lot of the SOCs that I've worked in are structured. So typically you have your tier one. So these are your low-level analysts, and that can be made up with juniors. It can be made up with people who are just starting out. It's that frontline job. So a tier one analyst is going to be going through, looking at those alarms, triaging those alarms, filtering those alarms, and trying to gain that information and try to extract as much information as possible that they can get out of that. You then typically will have a tier two. So that's someone with a bit more seniority in the team. They may have branched out. They may have gone through different specializations. They may be specialists in Windows, in Linux, in whatever it may be, threat hunting, threat detection, malware analysis. They act as that escalation point from a tier one analyst to be able to give a bit more structure and maybe give a bit more advice on a team. And then ultimately you then have your tier three. In our case, it's our SOC manager. Again, it's another escalation point inside that SOC. So you have these multiple paths, these multiple teams working together. You have your tier one taking away some of that low-level alarm, that low-level noise, to free up the tier twos and the tier threes to be able to go through alarms that are a bit more complicated, help out on incidents, and allow those guys to be able to specialize in certain areas. And then in our case as well, we have a practice lead that sits on top, and their role is really to oversee the SOC and make sure it performs optimally in its operation. But what I said earlier was, well, that's a SOC. That's the structure of people working a SOC, but that isn't just the SOC. So when we take a look back, you have your SOC operations, but then you have all of these other teams that are feeding into that SOC and helping that SOC build out and maintain that structure. So we have engineering, we have incident response, particularly in Clarinet, we have the forensic, we have the offensive security side, we have pen testers, we have researchers, we have all sorts of people that are able to feed information into the SOC to help the SOC in detections, and also allow that sort of purple team, red team, blue team approach to be able to assist both those teams in detections and also in that offensive side. And then on the other side, you've got content and research. You've got people doing research and development. You've got people looking at what is out there in the wild. What are they seeing? What's new? What's current? Making sure that the SOC is at the bleeding edge of detection and making sure that it has all of its procedures and its operations. You then have threat intelligence, again, sort of like the research and development, but they're making sure that we're pulling in the correct information, we're seeing into other areas that may be not visible to a SOC normally. You think about dark web, you think about public web scraping, OSINT analysis, open source intelligence. That's what your threat hunting teams are going to be doing. They don't necessarily sit inside the SOC in an operational term, but they sit on the outside because they're doing that research and development. And then you have GRC as well. A GRC is not related into SOC in terms of processes, but it allows the SOC to be able to use those teams to understand what we need to do in terms of regulatory compliance, what we need to do in terms of maintaining accreditations, how are we doing best practice, what are we doing around our audits, and allowing that, again, not a SOC team, but will feed into the SOC to help them understand things, to give them that greater context. So a SOC is made up of these tier 2 analysts, but there are many other teams that feed in, particularly at our SOC, into that SOC operations to allow them to be able to perform their functions as best as possible. So this is a very quick slide on what a process overview looks like. This is our SOC process overview. So on the left, we have infrastructure, we have clients, we have logs, we have everything that we need. That goes up into our correlation systems, Alien Vault, Sentinel, whatever it may be. That fires an alarm. That's when an analyst is stepping in. And that's what I'm going to show in this demo coming up, is what that analyst is doing with that alarm and how are we actually getting to something that's useful, valuable, and provides insight. And then we have a lot of that other service delivery element on the back end, ticket handling, ticket process, audit logging. Again, valuable things to have. You need an audit trail, particularly when you're dealing with high severity incidents. And then that feedback loop at the end, presenting what we found in that month, found in that quarter, optimization. Again, big element of those meetings down there at the bottom. I wanted to put this slide in because it's terms that I'm going to be using later on. It's terms that I've already used to start off with, but this is a P structure. This is how we structure, and most SOCs structure their priorities. We have P5s for false positives, then P4, P3, P2, P1 for incidents. And as you go higher up, the more severe an incident comes. SLAs are traditionally attached to these P numbers. So P4 being, it might be an incident, it might not be, we need some additional feedback. It's not really a security incident. It can probably wait a bit of time, all the way up to P1, active incident, we need to do something now. There's a threat inside the organization. Get together, war room, that's what you're talking about in terms of P1 incident. So what are they doing? I wanted to take this as an example attack, and it basically structures the same attack that I'm about to do on myself as well. But it gives a bit of insight into how a SOC can identify an incident and contain an incident, and all the steps that are needed for an incident to become severe, and in this case, ransomware at the end of it. So typically, you'll see initial access. So we talk about MITRE ATT&CK framework. Initial access is the first point inside a network. It's someone getting a foothold. In this case, phishing email, browse to a website, drive-by link, open up a macro. We have that exploit and that installation. So after you have an exploit and installation, you're going to see command and control. Someone needs to get hands on a keyboard, human operated ransomware in these cases. They're starting to move inside an organization. That's their pivot point. So when you talk about command and control, you're starting to look at Slither C2, Brute Ratal, Cobalt Strike, PowerShell Empire, these frameworks that allow multiple attackers and multiple users to be able to go onto a system and maintain that access. Then you move along that thing, you start to look at user account compromise, you're starting to look at lateral movement inside a network, ultimately to get a privileged account. So at the end of it, compromised domain account, and then exfiltration of data. So I've broken these down into a couple of different points in which a SOC would normally be looking at these data sources to try and intercept this particular attack. So when you're talking about phishing emails, browsing websites, you're looking at Office 365, Zscaler, web blogs, web proxies. When you start looking at that exploitation installation, lateral movement side of things, you're starting to think about your EDR logs, your server logs. Where is a user interacting? What systems are they interacting on? And then ultimately, firewall logs for that exfiltration of data, those command and control logs going outbound. Where are we seeing them talk to? What are we seeing them talk to? And when, crucially, did we start to see that happen? That's going to give us an idea about what we're working with here. So, how are they going to do it? So this is where we start talking about the demo. I've got all the slightly boring PowerPoint slides out of the way. Now we're actually going to see something that's useful, that's actually what an analyst is doing. So I have a lab set up. I have two servers, and I have a command and control server at the side. For the command and control server, I'm using a free tool called MITRE Caldera. It's created and maintained by the same people who do the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So it's a really good tool for me in engineering and for SOC, because we're able to automate attacks, we're able to script attacks, and have those automatically mapped to the MITRE ATT&CK framework so we can optimize our procedures. So in this case, That's my command and control. If I was doing this another way, it could be Cobalt Strike, it could be Brutal, it could be Slither, it could be anything. But in this case, Mitre Caldera, and then I've got a web server and then a Windows server sitting inside my Azure account. So tools I'm using, on the red team, I've got the Sandcat agent and Caldera. Those are my C2 frameworks. Those are my implants. On my blue side, on my defending side, I've got Defender for Cloud, Defender for Endpoint. I've got the AMA agent, so that's the Azure monitoring agent. And then I'm also using Sentinel as my SIEM. Why Sentinel? That's because that's where I spend most of my time these days. It could, again, be anything. It could be Alien Vault, it could be Splunk, it could be whatever. It's just a way of getting those logs in and ingesting those logs. So I will now go on to the demo. So what I've started to structure out here is I've got a couple of alarms that have come in to my SOC. So down here at the bottom, we've got a history file has been cleared, and I'm starting to see some recon commands. And these could be anything. These could be benign issues. Someone is, in these cases, running who am I. These are recon commands. They're also incredibly useful, normal commands that someone is going to use inside. As we can start to see now, as my attack is taking place, we can start to see files actually being dropped on a box. We'll get to those later as we start to go through this simulated piece. But what I'm really interested in here is I have these who am I commands. So that's going to come in. It initially starts to look a bit like a false positive, but I really want to start looking at that and try to understand exactly what's going on here. So an analyst is going to start opening this up. We're going to start looking at, okay, where did this start off? What do I know straight away? Well, I can see the username in my entity list. I can see it was run by myself. I can see it was run on our web server, and I can start to see some process things here. So I can see cell-c is running who am I. It's a bit of an odd way of running it, but whatever, it could be running from a script, it could be running from anywhere. Again, an analyst is starting to work through this to try and understand exactly what's happening here. Is this a false positive? Do we need to send this back for tuning, or do I need to investigate this further? So we'll start going in, we'll start looking at, well, what does that event do? What triggered that event to start off with? So in this case, we'll start going through, we'll start looking at that event. I've just pivoted into the Custo language now to start understanding a bit more about how did this start. So we can see everything here is UTC timestamp. So we are UTC +1 currently in the UK. So this started around 11 o'clock local time to us, 10 o'clock UTC. And I can see it was triggered. We've got multiple detections. I can see where this was. So this has come out of my Playground account. It's a reconnaissance alarm. That's how it's mapped in the MITRE ATT&CK framework. I've got a little bit of information here, so I'm going to start filling out my incident form. I can start noting the time, I can start noting the server, and I can start noting the user. So what I want to do is start pivoting. Okay, I can see who am I is run. I can see here's the query that was used to run this alarm. So I'm going to start pivoting now. I'm still going to start going in and trying to understand what those events actually were that caused this alarm to happen. So copy out my query, start that run. Okay, I've got 2 events. I can see now I've got process creation events. I can see the file that ran it. I can see the user. Again, I'm going through my process. I'm going through my notes now. I'm starting to see what exactly happened here. What do I need to bring to this investigation? So, okay, my process command line was shell-c who am I. Not really a very typical way of running who am I. You would just type who am I and it'd be run as the bash prompt or the shell prompt. Appending that bit at the start is unusual. So as an analyst, that's starting to raise something in the back of my mind that this is either a script or this is something else, because it's a little bit unusual. I can also see that it's being run by dash. And then as I start to go down, well, the initiating process parent file name is Splunk, but I don't use Splunk. There's not Splunk on this system. So that is starting to get a red flag. Why is Splunk on here? Okay, could have been left on by a migration. It could be an oversight. It could be something else. It could be someone else deploying a tool. Maybe it's another arm of the business is rolling out Splunk for whatever they need to do. They haven't told the security team, do we need to update our procedures? Do we need to update our policies? But it's noting that, okay, that came from Splunk. That's a bit odd. So I'm going to start looking at that now. So I'm going to start thinking, okay, well, if my device event is this, well, what else is Splunk doing? So let's go back to my original query. We'll take out the original query now and start looking down about what happened. So this looks a little bit noisy, but that's because I've already done this demo just to make sure that I didn't get cursed by a live demo breaking. So we ignore a little bit of what's down there at the bottom. We start looking at what happened at 11, because that's when we know our alarm got triggered. So let's start taking a look. We can see, okay, we've got a little bit of grep coming in. We can see, what else have we got running? Grep again. Again, all of these are starting to come from those same areas, those same files. We can see dash, the who am I is coming from dash, Splunk D again. Okay, so let's pivot. Let's start to see what else did Splunk do. So we'll set my query range to the past hour just to try and narrow down that scope a little bit. I'm really interested to see what Splunk is doing. Okay, I now have 24 events for Splunk doing process creation. I can see it's running who am I. I can see it's running make dir, so it's creating files. Why is it creating files? Again, these are all things that as an analyst, I'm going to start to think, this is something that isn't a false positive. I can see it out the corner here. Well, that looks like an IP address. What is an IP address doing in that process creation event? There's no reason Splunk is going to be run in this particular way. That's not how Splunk runs. I know from experience, my T2 might know from experience, that's not how this process is run. That's not how anything is working here. So we'll start to drill in. I can see odd port, I can see group is red, and it appears to be running in verbose mode. So let's start to drill into here. So, well, what's that IP address? What can I do with this information? I've got an IP address now. I need to start noting that down into my incident form. This is suddenly becoming something which is not a P5 in this case. This is an incident. How severe is this incident? So go over, use another tool, who is. I want to know who owns that IP address. Where is that IP address? Okay, it's owned by DigitalOcean in this case. Well, I know from our policies and procedures, we don't operate anything to do with DigitalOcean inside. So that's another red flag. Why have I got a DigitalOcean IP talking to a process on my server? Another red flag. Starting to note this down, I'm now starting to creep up from sort of a P3 to possibly P2 territory. So I want to understand a bit more about what's happening here. So we've got an IP address. We can see that it's starting to do things inside there. Well, I can start to see it's making a directory. It's making a directory called staged. Again, this is using the Caldera script. So a lot of this is very obvious what it's doing. In a normal real attack, you'd be possibly encoding this with base64, using normal file names. You would use something like Splunk if you maybe wanted to avoid detection a little bit there, but you'd name your files in a different way. But I'm very interested to see that this Splunk process is creating a staged file. That's odd. It's looking for files. It's looking for anything that contains PNG. It's looking for if they are not a maximum amount of size. Again, this is starting to look like human operated procedures. This is someone putting in these commands. They're actively looking for files. This is not a simple user doing this. We're starting to see very sort of key indicators in terms of malicious. I then start to go down here. Okay, I can see linenum being run now. So linenum is a very common enumeration framework. It's used for finding vulnerabilities on Linux. It's a bit of a light script. There is another script that will do more invasive testing, but it's not something that should ever really be run as part of a user's day-to-day activity. It's never something a sysadmin is going to run. It's never something that someone's going to be sat there running. So again, in my head and in my notes, I'm starting to look at this. Well, what else do I have? Groups being echoed out. There's a sleep in here, so possibly testing something. All of this is making me believe this is not something that is day to day. So now I need to start thinking, right, what information do I need to present back? What information is going to provide value to someone? I know I have an IP address, I know a process is running, and I know that user's running. So at this point, I'm going to start handing these tickets over. I'm going to start escalating this up inside the SOC to say, I think this is an incident. What do we need? So we need to start going around and start proving certain things. Well, how did that file get there? Do I need to spend time working out how that file got there right now? Probably not. The most important thing is I start to contain this incident and I start to make sure that this incident is locked down. So I'm going to start going through here. I might start pivoting back into, well, have I seen anything else in my alarms? Am I seeing anything different? So well, let's go back to my Azure portal, take a back look back at my Sentinel instance. Okay, my incident count has now rocketed. I'm starting to see enumeration of files. I'm starting to see more recon going on. I'm starting to see Defender has picked up Linenum has been run. Right, we are now P2. This is multiple instances on one single host. We're potentially looking at lateral movement. I need to start that process now. So again, logging all of this information in, taking all this information into our processes, making sure that enough information is given back. So I've confirmed this is a severe incident. I've got all of these numbers. I'll start going into our ITSM, the service now, collating all those incidents together, and now we start presenting that information back. So I think we've gone from really one incident to start to do that triage and start to understand what's happening in about 15 minutes now. And that's how fast something needs to happen. So when you're looking at particularly these human operated bits, it needs to be run at this sort of speed to be able to understand, because as far as what I can see going on right now, this is an active incident and things are happening as I type, as I see in front of me. I switch to local time, 12:19, there are still things being investigated by this process. There are still things being launched by this process. This isn't something which has disappeared. So what we can start to see again is, okay, the process has checked in again. We can see Linenum started to run. It's doing its work in the background. But the most concerning thing I can see now is curl data. So an attacker is now starting to offload data. What are they offloading? Why are they offloading? We are now P1 incident. We can see active attack inside the network. I can see exfiltration of data. I'm now going to move from really collecting information. I've got the rest of my team involved. I need to start going into response mode. So what I'm going to do from here typically is pivot over to my playbooks that I have in Sentinel. I'm going to isolate this machine. Clearly the machine's been compromised. The risk of disruption to an organization about a server being isolated and being off the network is outweighed by the fact that if this incident carries on, we are looking at a significant issue here. So I'm going to start going over, I'm going to start isolating that machine. Maybe one of the T2s is going to go off and do that because I have the best knowledge about what's going on. I need to start collecting more information. So we can start to pivot across and take more information out. I've collected that IP address. I need to start seeding my other tools. So I've got Defender running. What do I need to put into Defender to make sure that I can hunt for this on other servers potentially? Make sure that an attacker isn't sitting on another server and is potentially going to drop the same file. So I collect that file name. So I'm now going to start to want looking at file hashes. So I want to start looking at SHA-1 hashes, MD5 hashes. All of this information is useful to my EDR platform because that's what it's going to go out and block. It's going to take that file name. It's going to take those hashes. I'll add them as custom rules. I've automatically started to extend my reach into the network. So I take those file hashes, MD5, SHA-1 file hashes. I've got that for Splunk D now. I want to start going back and thinking, well, what about linenum? So I'll go off now, find my linenum, which is here, and grab those file hashes. So I know that Defender picked it up because I got that alert in the incident, but I want to make sure that I'm capturing this particular version. It was called linenum. Typically, it would be called something else. It could be called anything. So long as it's able to run its script, it will run. In this case, again, it's fairly open as to what's happening. I can see that they pulled the latest version out of GitHub, so it was a direct pull. Probably means that it's not a customized version of linenum. It's better for me to take those hashes now. I can verify that by extracting out this piece of information, taking it over here, and having a look to see what it's doing. Well, that command that was run was get linenum chmod, so make it an active executable in Linux, run it to temp exfil data. So now I have another file path I can use. That's another file path that's going to go into my report. Then I can see that curl command. So that curl command and that exfiltration of data actually came from linenum. So what you're seeing here is an attacker is running this, but they don't want to sit and watch that script run and note down all of the information. It's much quicker for them to output, that's that command there, output that to a file, exfiltrate that file, I'll review that later. This is going to give me information not on what's on the box, but how I need to elevate. So I know from my processes, tcadet is not a high profile user, so it doesn't have root permission on that box. But what I can start to understand this attacker is doing is they're trying to escalate, they're trying to elevate their permissions on this box. They're trying to elevate into something a bit more suspicious or something a bit more sort of higher privileged. I need to start to intercept that. So I've handed all this information off to my T2, potentially SOC manager. They're in the process of now calling the client, or in the terms of an internal SOC, making sure that we get the IT systems on board. This is a high priority incident. We need to get many people involved. We need network teams involved. We need sysadmins involved. Potentially, if we've got DevOps pipelines involved, we need developers involved. We need as many people in that are responsible for this system as possible to make sure we can start to understand how this attack happened. And whilst that is all happening, again, that analyst is sitting here to try and feed as much information into that process, into that ticket as possible. So I now know we have exfiltration of data. I now know where that's going. That's useful later on in a forensics point of view to say this particular strain of whatever, this particular attacker, it used these files, it used these locations. These become our IOCs. These become extremely useful when we're talking about incident response later on, potentially involving forensic response. I haven't identified how this file got on there. That's not really my concern right now. That can happen later on. I now know that this machine has been isolated. It's been contained, so that attacker has been removed from the system. I can maintain a forensically sound image of this machine, hand this over to my forensics teams, my forensics partners. They can come back and tell me how this got on the box. Or maybe I can do a mop-up later on, once I've handed over this information and we've got as much information as possible to contain this incident. I can go back and start looking at file creation logs. I can start looking at how something appeared. So what else do we have? I've got linenum being run. I can see that location that it's coming from. I've got my MD5 rules. I've sent those over to Defender. I can send those over to Sentinel-1. I can send those over to wherever I need to go. I'm starting to go back again, take a look. What else was run? What else have we seen inside here? Well, we've got more. We've got linenum running here. Back on there. Okay, it's starting to look like possibly this attack has finished now. The containment has worked. We're not seeing anything else running from that process. This is really good. We've contained that incident now. So I've collected my information. I've collected that IP address. My IP address is then going to go off to the networks team. Let's get that firewall rule put in place to block communications on here. whether it's Azure firewall, whether it's on-premise firewall, get that information in there, block that communication because we know this is known C2. So now as my tier one, I'm really done with this initial triage. I've completed it inside that half-an-hour window. I know all of the information and I've started to escalate that process. I've gone through, I know what file created what, I know how it was creating some of those files, I know how it's talking. Well, what else can I really bring to this now, apart from seeding more information in as that process is ongoing? So now a client's involved, security teams are involved, playbooks are being triggered on their side in terms of incident response. We've contained the incident by isolating the server. We're starting again, looping back, making sure that we found all that we needed to find, and that also we can start to understand a little bit about what this attacker was doing and maybe what their end goals were. Start to go back through those events. We can see that there's another staging file being created, this time in my root directory. So a bunch of files have been put into a tarball, and we can start to see that tarball being moved into a staging place and then potentially used for exfiltration later on. So if I pivot back, again, in my incidents, I'm starting to see possible recon commands. I can see those enumerations. This is just knowing what I've seen already. I can start to close down some of these incidents because really they're duplications of the same thing. And what you can understand here is actually from one attack can be very noisy. You can have many alarms that may there we go. I think I'm back now. Apologies for that. My internet just had a little hiccup. So I'm going through and I'm starting to look at these events. I can start to close down these events because I know they're duplicates. I know that they are low priority incidents. We can start to close those off now. And that's really sort of what an analyst is doing. And I kind of hope that that gives a little bit of an insight into what an analyst is doing in terms of going from one alarm, trying to collect as much information as quickly as possible, pivoting off different information as it becomes apparent to that analyst. So we went from who am I being called to a full attack chain at the end of it. So I went from my possible recon to understanding it was a file that was running that, not a user. It was a process that was running that. I then can start to understand a little bit about what was happening there. I can start to pivot off that information. I've collected IP addresses. That's useful for blocking. We contained the incident by using playbooks and isolating the machine. We've now gone down the route of this is going to take more than my half-an-hour window now. I've raised it up as a P1. I've met my SLAs, and I've started to understand that incident as much as possible to say this is an active incident. So a lot of this conversation sort of comes off the back of when the entire sort of premise for this webinar came off the back of talking to people and saying, well, you know, I'm seeing only 3 or 4 priority 3s events. I'm seeing some priority 4s, but actually I'm seeing 1,000 P5s. What are they doing? I'm not seeing alarms all the time. And it kind of sounds a little bit silly when you say it out loud. It's like I was expecting more alarms. I was expected to be attacked more. But that can be the view of someone who is potentially new to security. They've never really had this visibility before, but now they have it. What are the SOC actually doing? And I kind of hope that little demo that I've done here is trying to highlight off exactly what that SOC are doing, how they're doing it, and what they're doing to go through those processes, to go from something which seems benign to something which is actually a very severe event. So if I jump back in, I've got a couple of slides just to mop up on the end of that. Swap back over. So lessons learned. What are we going to send back up? What are we going to to send up to someone who may need this information again. So all of those things that we found in that attack. So we found that IP address, we found splunk.d, we saw linenum, and we also potentially saw some limpy stuff going on in the background. We saw indicators of it. So we've collected those MD5 hashes, those SHA-1 hashes, sent those over to the EDR MDR tool. We've taken that IP address, we've sent that over to our networks team. They're blocking it now. We know that we've got those detection rules in. We've contained this incident slightly. Now we engage that next process in terms of what's actually happening and how we're going to proceed in terms of forensics. So going back to that timeline, I think it's useful just to sort of see where we intercepted this attack along that ransomware attack that I showed at the top. So we don't actually know how it was installed on the file, on the server yet. We haven't gone through that process to understand how it appeared yet. We possibly missed how it was installed. That's something the SOC need to take back. That's an optimization on the rule set. We could see the command and control, but again, we didn't pick up on that command and control traffic. Do we need to go back? Do we need to tune firewall rules? It was communicating on a fairly unusual port of 88888. That's non-standard. That's an optimization that can go off to my networks team. That's an optimization that can go to the SOC to build more detection rules. What I did intercept was that lateral movement, that information gathering, that reconnaissance, and I started to be able to see potential exfiltration of data. I've stopped a domain compromise or a root account compromise in this case because I've been able to pick apart this attack as it was happening in front of me and understand what was happening. And we've managed to limit what was exfiltrated off of this server, but also crucially in terms of forensics, I know those files that were staged. Hopefully I've isolated the machine so those files haven't been deleted yet. I can go and review and see exactly what was pulled out. Maybe I need to go through those process events again and understand exactly how those files were exfiltrated off. Where did those files come from? We noted PNG was used to search. It's a good chance that was involved in this exfiltration of data, but what we limited was massive exfiltration of data. So we missed the exploitation, we missed that installation, we got that command and control, but crucially, we stopped that attack. So now we can go back, do that forensic response, take a look at this, see what we can do, how can we do this going forward, how can we improve? So that's the end of my presentation. I hope that was useful. I hope I've given a bit of an understanding about what a SOC analyst is doing with the tools that they have access to, how it involves those various different teams inside that SOC, how we can start to take a feed from those other teams inside the SOC, but also trying to show what something looks like from my side of the screen, what I'm doing in terms of what's my thinking. Where am I thinking about something is potentially suspicious, potentially odd, something that niggles that part of my brain that says, this isn't quite right. So I think now, Han, do we have any questions?
Yeah, we have a few. That was really good, Tom. So there's a few. So for those of you who've asked, will the slides be shared? Yeah, absolutely. So G is asking, is there a reason why you didn't note the SHA-256 hashes?
So it can be. I can take those hashes as well. For this particular case, I took my SHA-1 and my MD5 because I know that I've got a built pipeline that'll ingest those quite quickly. It doesn't matter. That's my personal preference to take those ones. If I wanted a bit more data integrity, I can note those. And as I go through my processes again, I'm going to start collecting that information anyway. That'll be the mop-up to really identify where this came. Those particular hashes can be very useful if I'm starting to look at custom files. Do I want to search for open source intelligence on those files? Virus total, has it ever been seen in the wild before? That SHA-256 is going to give me a bit more integrity. There's no chance of a collision so far on a 256, so I can extend it out. But the reason I took MD5 and SHA-1 was just that was as quick as I could get those into those EDR platforms at the time.
Perfect. So we've got a longer one from John has asked, is the integration of different feeds, e.g. Sentinel, Google, to an on-prem SIEM, he's given the example QRadar, feasible because it seems important for the big picture view?
Oh, I just lost that one. Integration of different feeds and SIEMs. Is it feasible and it seems important for a big picture view? No, absolutely. And that's where you can start to understand how a different tool is going to work. And there's a concept really around things like swivel chair SOC and looking at multiple panes. You want to try and centralize as much logs in one place. You can do things like pulling in logs from other SIEM platforms. So in these cases, you've got, you may have Sentinel, you may have something else, 40 SIEM, you may have another one. You can feed those all into one view. You can then start to create procedures and policies on top of that, scripts possibly to build out and try and centralize as much as possible. But how we really do it in our world and how an MSSP is going to really do this is you want to centralize those tickets. As soon as you get an alarm, there should always be a ticket associated with that alarm. So you do move a little bit away from trusting the SIEM as an alerting tool visually and relying on that ITSM platform, using those tickets to then be able to pivot to the tool that reported it on it, and then using possibly SOAR overlays on top to be able to query multiple data sources at the same time, centralize all that data. That's where you start to go into multiple tiered approaches, moving away from just the SIEM, overlaying SOAR, overlaying multiple different tools on top of it. Quite a technical SOC really at that point, but that's how you can really extend visibility a little bit.
Nice. Quick one from, or short one from Ian. How many team members are working at any given time?
That can vary massively depending on your SOC. I think inside of Clarinet, we currently have about 4 running each shift and then escalations on top of that. So a SOC could be as little as a team of 2 running, 2 much larger SOCs running potentially hundreds of analysts at any one point of time, going to a SOC that runs in a follow the sun sort of operational model. So you've always got someone looking at it in a daytime point of view. Our particular SOC runs 24/7, so we have shift rotations inside. So we have analysts that work day shifts, we have analysts that work night shifts. Our particular one is a 12-hour shift. That allows that handover. Again, our SOC runs Bristol and Leeds, so we have dual location. The Bristol team will work those 2 shifts, then hand over to the Leeds. They'll work their shifts. So you have that sort of localization between shift teams built of about 4, and that's how they really go operate. But again, a SOC can operate on as little as 2 people. It could be as high as hundreds, potentially thousands in way higher enterprise space.
Yeah. So from Nick, so hello, hi Nick. Question about agents. How do your SIM tools talk to the customer's network and server nodes?
So in this particular example, I used the Defender agent. So the Defender agent is talking to my my instance of Defender inside my tenancy. If I was using the AMA agent as well, that's talking to my Sentinel instance directly. The Defender agent talks on HTTPS the same as the AMA agent. When I start looking at things like Alien Vault as our other tool, my agents either talk on HTTPS directly to my instance of Alien Vault, or if I need to use something a bit more specific like NXLog, that's going to be talking via syslog to a collector that's hosted inside an organization. That sensor is then communicating on HTTPS back out to my instance. So many different ways that a SIEM tool can operate like that, but in our particular instances, because they're cloud-centric SIEM tools, there's no real on-premise footprint. Those agents are typically talking out on HTTPS using encrypted channels to a cloud system or to a centralized syslog collector, and then that syslog collector is talking outbound on an encrypted channel.
Grand. Thanks for all the questions from the audience. There's loads here. we've got one actually. So what analytic rules are you using? It's broad, but.
So in Sentinel, you don't get a lot of stuff out the box. I think you get quite a lot of fusion rules and some of the abnormality detection rules, but for these particular events and things that I've shown today, they were custom created rules. So those are rules that I've gone out and created. I can't remember how many rules we have now. In Alien Vault, I think it's probably close to 2,500, if not more, 2,800 maybe correlation rules. In Sentinel, internally, we're building out our capability, so we're starting to see a large influx of rules, but it's sort of creating an analytics rules is not a one size fits all. A lot of those rules are very generic, and in a lot of those cases I need to tune out. That particular rule there had a bunch of commands that they needed to look for, who is hostname, some other recon sort of basic enumeration commands, but I already had to filter out 2 processes because they were creating a lot of false positives. So it's good to take those out of the box rules, but a lot of those out of the box rules really need to be tuned. And again, that's where the SOC expertise comes in, because you're starting to take those tunings, influencing your rules, maintaining your rules, optimizing your rules, so you don't get overwhelmed with 3,000 false positives because OMS agent decided to collect some information weirdly at 3 o'clock in the morning and it went wild. So out the box, not a lot of rules really in Sentinel, but we supplement that quite a lot with our own abilities and our own capability.
So Christopher has asked, and I'm going to tag something on to the end of this actually. Christopher's asked, do you have people on call? I think also an important question to ask is how responsible should a SOC be when it comes to incident response? Where is a good place to draw the line?
So because we operate a 24/7 SOC, we don't really have that on-call internally in our SOC because there is eyes on glass 24/7. The more senior people in the SOC, there is the ability to be able to call them out. There is an ongoing rota to be able to escalate an incident. In some cases, it may need someone who's not on call internally to be able to be involved in an incident, in which case there is the ability to be able to call those out. But as we stand now, we don't operate that on call internally. We used to, but now we have eyes on glass 24/7. That's typically a smaller SOC would operate on call. So you could have eyes on glass 7 till 7, and then the following 7 till 7 could operate on an on-call policy. So using something like PagerDuty, maybe handing over to an internal team that runs 24/7, a service desk, a NOC, something like that, that then has the ability to call out a SOC analyst. I've worked in SOCs like that before. How we operate as well, sort of internally, is we have that on-call into a client. So when we onboard that service, we build out those pathways and those call sheets to make sure that when we find an incident like this at 3 o'clock in the morning, who do I need to call to get out of bed right now? Because that's a P1, someone needs to be aware. So that's where an MSSP is typically going to work with a client to build out what does that response model look like internally to them, allow them the flexibility of maintaining their on-call structure, maintaining what they need to do, but also it just gives that seamless point of view from the SOC. We don't need to call anyone internally. We just call you on this number because we need to do this 3 o'clock in the morning on Christmas Eve.
Alec has asked, how do you size, or how do you get the right size for a SOC? How many events can a SOC analyst manage? And how do you identify when you've hit a crunch and there are more events or issues than your team can handle?
That's a question that is probably worth $1 million if you can answer that one correctly. It's something that plagues not just the SOC, but really any sort of service desk or anything, particularly in an MSSP world or MSP world, is how much does one SOC analyst need to take? And internally, we have a lot of calculations based on current operational models and looking at events, but it becomes a bit of a dark art in a SOC, because particularly when you start to think about how much data is retained in a SOC and maybe potentially scaling a system that way. So if you've got 14 terabytes of logs being stored a month, that means XYZ FTEs. It's not as a clean match as that, really. You're starting to think about, well, a system with 14 terabytes of data may generate 1,500 alarms a month, but a sort of less mature, in a security posture point of view, company that has 500 gig of logs, they may generate 7,500 tickets because they don't have those controls in place. It's a little bit like the Wild West. There's all sorts of stuff. So it's a long way to say it's very hard to work that out. Everyone does it slightly differently, but typically you're starting to think about how many tickets can someone feasibly do? What is your current SOC running at? And then also talking to the staff. Are you feeling the crunch right now? Are you running at what you believe? That's where the SOC manager comes in. That's where the practice lead comes in making sure that the morale is good in the team. They're not getting burnt out. They're not getting alert fatigue. And then building those again into those operational models, looking at data size, user size of an organization, ticket volumes in an organization, and then trying to work that out. And if anyone has a foolproof way of doing that, it's probably worth a lot of money, because there's a lot of people that have that problem right now.
Nice. So we only have a few minutes left, but there are definitely more questions here. I think, so with any questions that relate to a Clarinet service that you're receiving, it's probably best to just get in touch with us directly. For any others that we don't manage to answer right now, we'll follow up with you. But as a final one then, from Hassan, so is Sentinel more commonly used over Splunk, and which from your experience seems to be more common?
I would say it's probably the opposite. Splunk is a very legacy tool. It's very well known. It's incredibly powerful, and a lot of companies are using it. Sentinel is very new. I think Sentinel has been around. If anyone is at Microsoft on this call, you'll probably hate me, but I think it's only been around for about 4 years. It's only really been viable for sort of the past 2. You can see a pivot going into Sentinel. You can see a lot more people starting to look at Sentinel. There are incentives from Microsoft, and there are incentives from centralizing infrastructure into one place. There are benefits from doing that, but it's sort of what's more prevalent. Splunk is probably more, but then you have Logarithm, QRadar, ArcSight. There's 1,001 different ones, 40 Seam. I think Splunk is probably the biggest. Sentinel is a conversation I'm having more with people about investigating Sentinel, investing in Sentinel. A lot sort of larger enterprise people are starting to evaluate Sentinel, but it's going to take a long time for that shift to happen. People are invested in tools. There are procedures. It's not as simple as being able to rip one out and replace the other. It's a large project to do that. So yeah, a long way of saying probably Splunk is the one that we see the most, followed by things like Alien Vault, ArcSight, Logarithm, but more of Sentinel now.
Perfect. Well, yeah, I mean, like I said, we will follow up, because there are some good questions here, and so some of them need like a good full answer. So we will do that. Tom, that was really great. Thank you so much. Just to reiterate again that we will send out the recording and the slides probably tomorrow. And yeah, thank you for joining us, everyone. And really hope that you'll join us in October and December as well. But have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.